The sun had just started rising over New York City, painting the tall glass buildings with gold light. Inside one of those skyscrapers on the 47th floor, people were rushing to prepare for one of the biggest business meetings of the year. The air smelled like fresh coffee and new beginnings. Everyone knew that today's deal could change the future of a major tech company. It wasn't just any meeting. It was the final step in securing a $3.3 billion investment deal. Reporters had been talking about it for weeks, calling it one of the biggest funding rounds in recent history. The company leading the deal was Hale Technologies, a rising star in artificial intelligence and smart systems. Its CEO, Richard Hale, was known for being bold, confident, and sometimes too proud. The boardroom was designed to impress. A long glass table, large digital screens showing market graphs, and walls decorated with sleek modern art. Assistants hurried around, arranging documents and checking microphones. Every seat was filled with powerful people, investors, board members, and business partners. They were all waiting for the man who could make or break this deal, Marcus Green. Marcus wasn't just another investor. He was one of the most respected venture capitalists in the country. Starting from humble beginnings, he had built his own investment firm from scratch. Over the years, he had funded dozens of successful startups, earning a reputation for spotting talent before anyone else. But what made Marcus different wasn't just his business sense, it was his calm confidence and quiet dignity. When Marcus walked into the room, the energy shifted. He wore a simple dark suit, no flashy watch or expensive jewelry. Yet the moment he entered, everyone noticed him. His presence had weight. People respected him, not because of money, but because of his story. He had faced struggles, discrimination, and countless rejections in his early career. But he never let anger or bitterness define him. He believed in hard work, respect, and integrity. Richard Hale, the CEO, was already standing near the head of the table, smiling proudly. He was surrounded by his team, all whispering about how much this deal would boost their company's value. To Richard, this was more than business. It was about power and prestige. He liked being in control, being admired, and being the man everyone looked up to. As Marcus approached, a few people stood to greet him. "Mr. Green, it's an honor to have you here," one executive said politely. Marcus smiled warmly and shook their hands one by one. When he finally reached Richard, he extended his hand with the same respect he offered everyone else. But in that moment, something strange happened. Richard looked at Marcus's hand for a second, then simply folded his arms and gave a stiff nod instead. "Good to finally meet you," he said without moving to shake hands. The room went silent. The sound of quiet breathing filled the space. A few people exchanged awkward glances. It wasn't just a simple gesture. Everyone felt what it meant. Richard's refusal wasn't out of forgetfulness. It was deliberate. His cold smirk said it all. He didn't see Marcus as an equal. Marcus noticed it too. For a brief moment his expression froze, but he quickly regained his composure. He didn't say a word. Instead, he lowered his hand gently, smiled politely, and replied, "Good to meet you too, Mr. Hale." Then he took his seat, calm and professional as ever. But inside, Marcus could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't the first time he had been treated like that. Judged before being known, dismissed before being heard. Still, he believed that grace is more powerful than pride. He knew that reacting in anger would only lower him to the other man's level. The meeting continued, though the tension in the room never faded. The executives discussed numbers, strategies, and long-term plans. Graphs flashed on the screen. Everyone spoke with energy, but a quiet discomfort lingered. A few people kept stealing glances at Marcus as if silently apologizing for what had happened. Marcus listened carefully to every presentation, asked sharp questions, and gave thoughtful insights. Despite the awkward start, he handled himself with pure professionalism. His words carried wisdom and experience. Even those who didn't know him well could tell he was a man of vision. Meanwhile, Richard tried to pretend nothing had happened. He spoke loudly, joked with others, and avoided Marcus's gaze. But deep down, his ego had already made a mistake, one that would cost him far more than he could ever imagine. As the meeting came to an end, the investors thanked Marcus for his input. Papers were signed, plans were made, and smiles were exchanged, at least on the surface. Marcus stood up, shook hands with everyone who offered, and gave one last polite nod to Richard before leaving the room. The glass doors closed behind him, and the city skyline stretched out before him. Marcus paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and looked out at the view. The city below was full of life, energy, and opportunity. He didn't feel angry and just disappointed. Not for himself, but for how easily some people still let arrogance blind them. He knew that respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned. And while some men measured success by power, others measured it by principle. As Marcus stepped into the elevator, he pulled out his phone. His calm face hid the quiet fire inside him. He made a single call, not out of revenge, but out of resolve. He knew that true power doesn't shout, it acts. What would happen next would shake the business world to its core. The room felt tense, like the calm before a storm. Everyone thought the meeting would flow smoothly, but there was an invisible crack in the air, one that only a few noticed. Marcus Green had been calm and collected, but even he could sense the subtle weight of judgment that hung in the room. As the introductions moved forward, all eyes were on the CEO, Richard Hale. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without saying much. His smile was sharp, almost rehearsed, and his posture screamed authority. When he reached Marcus, the energy in the room shifted, almost as if time slowed for a moment. Marcus extended his hand, a universal gesture of respect and equality. But Richard hesitated. He didn't just hesitate. He froze, tilted his head slightly, and looked Marcus up and down as if deciding whether he deserved to be acknowledged. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smirk, he stepped back and folded his arms. No handshake. Not a single acknowledgement beyond a cold nod. The silence that followed was deafening. Some executives shifted in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing happened. Cameras from the media team captured the moment. Though no one knew it yet, this one small gesture would go viral. Not for its grandeur, but for its shocking audacity. Marcus could feel the sting, but he didn't show it. His mind raced not with anger, but with calculation. He understood something most people overlooked. The hand that refuses to shake can reveal far more than words ever could. It was a test, intentional or not, and Marcus had never failed a test in his life. Instead of reacting, he gave a measured, polite smile and lowered his hand gently. "Good to meet you, Mr. Hale," he said evenly, his voice calm, steady, and controlled. Every word carried dignity. Every gesture radiated restraint. The room remained frozen for a few seconds longer, caught between admiration and disbelief. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. Some wanted to speak up, but the weight of the moment, the unspoken tension, silenced them. Even Richard's team could sense that their CEO's pride had just made a subtle but dangerous misstep. Marcus took his seat, straight-backed and composed, eyes forward. Inside, however, his mind was already moving. He was thinking ahead, planning quietly, knowing that one moment of disrespect doesn't define a person, but one correct move after that can change everything. Richard tried to move on, speaking louder than before, cracking jokes, and projecting confidence, but the room had changed. The simple act of rejecting a handshake had exposed cracks in his armor. Everyone could feel it. Marcus wasn't just a guest, he was a force to be reckoned with. And in that silent, tension-filled room, a quiet battle had begun. Not with words, not with threats, but with power, presence, and principle. By the time the meeting began in earnest, everyone understood one truth. Respect is earned, pride can blind, and one small gesture can set in motion events that no one, not even a billionaire CEO, can control. The room seemed to hold its breath. Time had slowed to a crawl after the failed handshake, and for a few moments it felt like the walls themselves were watching. Every click of a pen, every shuffle of papers, even the soft hum of the air conditioner seemed louder than usual. The silence wasn't just awkward. It was heavy, like a weight pressing down on everyone in the room. No one spoke. Not Richard, not the board members, not even the junior executives who normally chattered to fill empty space. Their eyes darted from Marcus to Richard, searching for any sign of what would happen next. Some faces betrayed discomfort, others barely masked curiosity. The power dynamics in that room had shifted, though silently. Marcus sat still, calm, his hands folded neatly on the table. He wasn't fuming, and he wasn't trying to send a message. He was simply observing. Every nuance, every twitch, every reaction was being catalogued in his mind. In the world of high-stakes business, Silence often said more than words, and right now it was screaming volumes. Richard, on the other hand, tried to act normal. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and laughed lightly at something one of his assistants said. But the laughter was hollow, forced, like a mask slipping slightly at the edges. Inside he could feel it, a subtle unease creeping into the room, one he hadn't anticipated. Pride had blinded him, and the room, previously under his control, now hummed with tension he couldn't command. Minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. The executives avoided eye contact with Richard, pretending to focus on their notes or the graphs displayed on the screens. Some whispered quietly to their neighbors, exchanging nervous glances. They had seen arrogance before, but rarely had it backfired so clearly and so immediately. Even the air seemed charged. The sunlight streaming through the skyscraper windows no longer felt warm. It felt like it was spotlighting the CEO's misstep. Marcus, meanwhile, maintained a composed calm that drew attention. His quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to Richard's forced bravado. It was subtle, almost invisible to those untrained in reading people, but powerful enough to tip the balance of authority in the room. Finally, Marcus spoke, not to scold, not to confront, but with measured professionalism that reminded everyone why he was respected. He asked a precise question about the company's growth projections, his tone calm but firm. Instantly, the focus shifted. The room moved from tension to strategy, from discomfort to business. Yet beneath the surface, the memory of that unshaken hand lingered, a quiet reminder of a moment that had already begun to shape the future. Richard tried to regain control, speaking louder, inserting his ideas with more confidence, but inside he knew something had changed. That awkward silence wasn't just a pause in conversation. It was a reflection of the imbalance he had created. And though no one had said it aloud, everyone in that room understood one truth. Respect had been denied, and the consequences would ripple far beyond this meeting. As the discussions continued, Marcus remained steady, his calm presence a silent challenge. The room had learned a lesson in tension, humility, and the subtle power of presence. And while the meeting would eventually move on, the echo of that awkward silence would linger, like a quiet storm gathering strength behind the scenes. In that pause, in that unspoken moment, the foundation of what was to come had already been laid. The room had emptied, but the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Marcus didn't rush out. He paused in the hallway, letting the echo of the boardroom fade behind him. Every step he took was deliberate, measured. He wasn't just leaving a room, he was assessing a battlefield. Today had been more than a meeting. It was a subtle test of ego and influence. As he stepped into the elevator, his calm exterior hit a mind racing at lightning speed. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen, but he didn't dial immediately. Instead, he thought about the network he had spent years building. Powerful investors, venture partners, and strategic allies. He knew their tendencies, their goals, their priorities. He understood that in the world of high-stakes funding, one well-placed call could topple mountains. With a deep breath, Marcus tapped the first number. He didn't explain or exaggerate. He simply stated the facts, framing the situation with subtle precision. Within minutes, the ripple effect began. Messages flew across encrypted lines, whispers turned into inquiries, and one call quietly set off a chain reaction. The men and women who had the power to control billions were now listening, evaluating, questioning. Back in the boardroom, Richard Hale had returned to his office, believing he had regained composure. He leaned back in his chair, smiling confidently, unaware that the very foundation of his empire was quietly shifting. Marcus's single call had planted seeds that would grow faster than Richard could anticipate. Every investor who had previously nodded in agreement was now reassessing. Every partnership Richard had assumed was secure now wavered. Outside, the city pulsed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing in skyscraper offices. Marcus walked along the street, phone still in hand, exuding a calm energy that belied the force he was unleashing. Power wasn't loud, he knew. It was quiet, precise, and invisible until it struck. And today he was orchestrating a move that would shift billions, reshape reputations, and prove one simple truth. Arrogance cannot withstand strategy. By the time evening fell, Richard's confident grin had begun to fade. Emails pinged. Calls came in. The investors he had counted on were now hesitant, cautious, asking questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Marcus didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He simply watched, knowing that the true power of respect, reputation, and influence was finally asserting itself. In the shadows of corporate power, one calm, deliberate action had begun to rewrite the rules. What had started as a slight, a simple refusal to shake a hand, was now blossoming into a moment that would forever change the course of Richard Hale's empire, all because Marcus knew how to let silence speak and action follow. By the following morning, the city had awoken to the usual hum of traffic, honking cars and bustling streets. But in the sleek glass towers of Manhattan, a storm was quietly brewing, one invisible to the public, yet potent enough to shake empires. Marcus Green's single phone call from the previous day had set off a ripple, subtle at first, but growing stronger with every passing hour. In boardrooms scattered across the city, financial advisors and top investors began reviewing the deal with fresh eyes. Whispers traveled faster than emails. "Have you seen the reports?" one whispered. "Marcus Green is involved," another replied. "We need to reconsider." The very name that Richard Hale had once brushed aside as just another investor now carried weight capable of toppling him. Richard arrived at the office that morning, expecting to finalize the final touches of his $3.3 billion funding round. He walked through the polished corridors, his mind racing with strategies to impress and reassure his investors. He smiled confidently at assistants, greeted board members with nods, and entered the conference room prepared for routine dominance. But the usual energy he commanded was gone. The atmosphere was charged with subtle tension, a quiet dissonance he couldn't identify at first. Then the emails started arriving. At first, a few polite inquiries, almost innocuous. Then the messages grew sharper. Questions about corporate ethics, transparency, and management integrity. A few partners whom he had considered loyal requested emergency calls. The undercurrent was unmistakable. Marcus's involvement had triggered doubt, scrutiny, and caution among those holding the company's lifeblood, the funding. Even Richard's most trusted advisors began whispering nervously. "Should we reconsider?" one asked. "This could jeopardize the round," another admitted. In an instant, the solid ground Richard had taken for granted began to crack beneath him. Every investor who had previously nodded in agreement was now hesitating. Hesitation in finance is dangerous. Hesitation in a $3.3 billion deal is catastrophic. Marcus, meanwhile, remained calm. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His reputation and strategic network were enough. He knew that influence doesn't come from aggression. It comes from leverage, timing, and subtle precision. Each connection he had in the financial world now subtly nudged decisions in his favor, creating a domino effect. A few major investors began pulling back verbally, citing reassessments, while others quietly froze their commitments. By midday, the ripple had grown into a wave. Investors once eager to sign contracts were now reevaluating every clause. Analysts began circulating internal reports questioning corporate culture and ethical practices at Hale Technologies. Social media chatter, fueled by insiders leaking subtle hints, started hinting at tension within the company. The public was unaware, but the financial world was watching, sensing a shift. Richard tried to act. He sent messages, made calls, scheduled urgent meetings. He tried to reassure investors, projecting confidence, charisma, and charm. But every move felt like flailing against a current he couldn't control. The silence from Marcus's corner, combined with the quiet influence he had wielded, had created a force too powerful to counteract in a day. It wasn't just money at stake, it was reputation, credibility, and power. By evening, the consequences became undeniable. Several major investors had officially paused their commitments, and the once solid $3.3 billion funding round teetered on the edge. Richard sat in his office, staring at his reflection in the glass, realizing for the first time how one act of arrogance, a refused handshake, had triggered this cascade. Pride, he now understood, could cost more than respect. It could cost billions. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding within towering walls. But in those halls, Marcus Green's influence had already rewritten the narrative. What had begun as a minor slight, a subtle moment of disrespect, had grown into a financial upheaval that would forever alter the course of Hale Technologies. The ripple effect was no longer subtle, it had become unstoppable. Each hesitation, each withdrawn commitment, each raised eyebrow from investors added momentum to the wave. Marcus's quiet power was reshaping the boardroom, proving that true influence often comes not from force or intimidation, but from strategy, patience, and an unwavering belief in one's principles. And as the sun set over the skyline, casting golden light across the city, one fact was clear. In the game of high-stakes finance, respect is not optional, and one moment of arrogance can create consequences far beyond imagination. Richard Hale sat alone in his office late that evening, the city lights casting long shadows across the sleek, polished floors. The room, which had always felt like a fortress of power, now seemed unusually quiet, almost suffocating. Normally, he thrived in the energy of control, meetings, presentations, investors hanging on his every word. But tonight, that confidence was gone. Something had shifted, and he felt it deeply in his chest. It began with the phone calls, the emails, the subtle withdrawals of commitments he had always taken for granted. Each notification was a small, cutting reminder that the world he had built around money and prestige was fragile. The $3.3 billion funding round he had assumed would be secured without question now dangled in uncertainty. Panic crept into him, the kind he hadn't felt since the early days of building his empire, when success wasn't guaranteed. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as his mind replayed the morning's events. That handshake, that single moment. He had dismissed Marcus Green with a cold smirk, thinking it insignificant. It was meant to assert dominance, a subtle display of power, but now he realized it had been a glaring misstep, a crack in the armor he had carefully constructed. Richard's mind raced through the possibilities. How could a single man, one investor he had underestimated, create such a ripple? He replayed Marcus's calm, composed demeanor, the quiet confidence, the dignity that had filled the room like an invisible force. The realization hit him hard. Marcus hadn't needed to yell, threaten, or assert. His presence alone had shifted the balance. Power, Richard finally understood, could exist quietly, without arrogance, without bluster. The CEO's pride, which had long been his greatest asset, was now his greatest vulnerability. He thought of the board, the investors, the partners who had trusted him implicitly. Each one now questioned not just his leadership, but his judgment, his character, his ethics. Richard felt a rare sense of humility, the uncomfortable kind that gnaws at the core of a man accustomed to absolute control. He remembered all the times he had believed money could solve everything, that influence and charm could smooth over any mistake. But Marcus had proven him wrong. Respect cannot be bought, he realized. Trust cannot be commanded, and arrogance, no matter how justified in one's own mind, can unravel the strongest of empires. Richard's reflection in the glass window looked unfamiliar to him. The confident, untouchable man he had imagined himself to be was gone. In his place sat a CEO stripped bare, confronted with the consequences of pride and ignorance. He felt a bitter mix of anger, frustration, and grudging admiration for Marcus Green, the man whose single phone call had quietly upended his world. Hours passed. Richard stared at the city below, lights twinkling like stars scattered across the concrete jungle. The hum of traffic outside felt distant, almost irrelevant. He knew that even if he could scramble to regain investor confidence, the lesson had already been delivered, permanent and inescapable. One moment of disrespect, one refusal to extend a simple hand, had triggered a cascade of events he could no longer control. By the time he finally leaned back in his chair, exhaustion mixed with clarity. He understood that business was not just about numbers, contracts, or prestige. It was about people, principles, and integrity. Marcus had shown him that strength comes not from dominance, but from quiet conviction and unwavering dignity. Richard realized that rebuilding what had been lost would take more than charm or strategy. It would require reflection, humility, and an acknowledgement of the very human lessons he had ignored. In that moment, for the first time in years, he questioned not just his decisions but himself, and deep down a small, reluctant part of him knew he had been defeated not by skill, but by the quiet force of respect, a power far more potent than arrogance, far more enduring than wealth. The empire he had built on confidence and control now faced its reckoning, and he could not ignore it. For the first time, Richard Hale understood that the real cost of disrespect is never money. It is the unseen authority, the trust and the influence that cannot be reclaimed once lost. And in that realization, a new story was quietly unfolding. One that would define both his legacy and the extraordinary man who had reminded him that true power is measured not in billions, but in character. The following days unfolded like a quiet storm. While Richard Hale wrestled with the consequences of his pride, Marcus Green moved with calm precision. He didn't broadcast his influence, nor did he boast about the chain reaction his single phone call had triggered. Instead, he let the ripple of his actions grow naturally, quietly steering events in a way that would teach lessons far larger than money. Marcus spent the morning reviewing his network, connecting with key investors, partners, and allies, not to intimidate but to inform. He framed every conversation with clarity, professionalism, and subtle wisdom. There were no threats, no grand gestures, no dramatics, just facts, insight, and the undeniable weight of a man who commanded respect by action rather than words. By midday, the consequences of the CEO's arrogance had begun to crystallize. Investors, previously eager to pour billions into Hale Technologies, began formally withdrawing, citing concerns over corporate culture, leadership integrity, and governance practices. Social media quietly caught wind of the events, with influential commentators hinting at tension within the company. By evening, the story had gone viral, not through sensationalism, but through respect for Marcus's unwavering dignity. But Marcus didn't celebrate the downfall of a man or a corporation. Instead, he focused on the message that this moment conveyed. Respect matters, humility matters, and true leadership is defined not by power, but by character. He released a carefully worded statement to the press and his investors, emphasizing integrity, fairness, and the importance of equality in business. The statement resonated worldwide, not because it attacked Richard, but because it reflected the values that should guide every boardroom, every decision, and every leader. Meanwhile, Richard watched helplessly as the empire he had built began to fracture. Calls that had once been routine now carried tension. Partners he had trusted began second-guessing him. His arrogance had created a vacuum that Marcus's quiet, principled action had filled. And for the first time, Richard realized that Marcus had won, not by confrontation, but by exemplifying exactly what he himself had failed to understand. The story became more than a business lesson. It became a global symbol. Marcus was celebrated not for his wealth, but for his integrity. Students, entrepreneurs, and executives studied the events, analyzing how a single act of respect, or its denial, could shift the course of billions of dollars. Marcus's demeanor, humility, and calculated precision became a blueprint for leadership, proving that true influence comes from consistency and principle rather than aggression. By the end of the week, Marcus had transformed a moment of personal slight into a triumph for ethics, dignity, and fairness. Investors and partners sought his guidance, startups looked to him for mentorship, and the public admired the quiet power of his decisions. His approach reinforced a timeless lesson. When faced with arrogance, responding with calm strategy and integrity not only preserves one's own dignity but can reshape the world around you. Even Richard, in his private moments of reflection, could not deny it. He had been bested not by brilliance or cunning, but by the quiet, unwavering strength of a man who refused to compromise his values. Marcus's victory was not flashy or loud, it was enduring. It was the kind of victory that leaves a mark, not just on one person, but on an entire industry. In the end, the ultimate turnaround was not financial. It was moral, cultural, and symbolic. Marcus had taken what could have been a personal insult and transformed it into a defining moment of leadership, showing the world that true power is earned through respect, humility, and ethical action. And as he walked through the city streets, unseen by the millions who now admired him from afar, Marcus Green carried no pride in the destruction he had caused, only a quiet satisfaction. The world had witnessed a masterclass in integrity, and the message was clear: respect always prevails, arrogance always falters, and character is the truest measure of power. Months passed, but the reverberations of that single defining meeting were far from over. What had begun as a moment of personal slight An unshaken hand had blossomed into a global lesson in respect, power, and character. Marcus Green's quiet actions continued to echo, shaping conversations in boardrooms, universities, and media outlets alike. The world remembered not just the funding drama, but the principle that had guided every move Marcus made. Dignity matters more than dollars, and integrity outlasts arrogance. Hale Technologies, once a symbol of unchecked ambition, had been permanently altered. Richard Hale, now humbled, had retreated from the public eye, forced to reckon with the consequences of his pride. For him, the lesson had been painful, public, and inescapable. But Marcus had turned what could have been a moment of personal revenge into something far more meaningful, a demonstration of quiet strength and principled leadership. Marcus's influence extended beyond the confines of the financial world. Entrepreneurs, students, and professionals began studying the story as a blueprint for handling adversity, prejudice, and high-stakes conflict. Business schools dissected the events, analyzing how a single, well-calculated response to disrespect could shift billions in investment and redefine leadership itself. Articles, podcasts, and seminars referenced his calm, strategic approach, emphasizing that real power is subtle, calculated, and guided by ethics rather than ego. Yet Marcus never sought the spotlight. He didn't boast about his victory or claim credit for the shift in billions. To him, the true reward was seeing respect restored in the boardroom, justice served not through force or aggression, but through intelligence, patience, and moral clarity. He understood that a legacy isn't built on wealth or headlines. It's built on the principles one upholds, the examples one sets, and the quiet ways in which one empowers others. In the years that followed, Marcus launched initiatives to support minority entrepreneurs, mentor young leaders, and promote ethical business practices. Each project, each investment, carried the same lessons he had exemplified during that fateful meeting. Integrity, respect, and strategic thinking are more valuable than any contract or handshake. His story became a symbol of hope and inspiration, showing that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, calculating, patient, and unshakable. The world had witnessed the rise of a quiet titan, not through intimidation or wealth, but through the enduring power of character. And the memory of that day, the unshaken hand that sparked a 3.3 billion ripple, became a story told repeatedly, not for drama, but for the timeless lesson it carried. Respect matters. Humility triumphs over arrogance, and true leadership leaves a legacy that cannot be bought, only earned. Even today, when business leaders recount the story, the lesson remains clear. Marcus Green had shown that one person, armed with dignity, wisdom, and strategic patience, could reshape not just a company, but the culture of an entire industry. It was a reminder that real power isn't measured by money, but by the respect one commands and the example one leaves behind. In the end, the legacy was simple, yet profound. A single act of principled action can echo through time, changing lives, industries, and even the course of history. Marcus had proven that when you choose integrity over ego, the impact isn't temporary, it is eternal.